The wind arrived before the bad news did. It swept across the rolling hills of Everly Manor, bending the last golden leaves of autumn and rattling the bare branches that lined the long stone drive. Beneath a gray sky heavy with rain, Lady Seraphina Everly stood beside a freshly covered grave, her black mourning veil trembling in the cold air. On either side of her stood her sons. 8-year-old Oliver held his shoulders stiff as though courage alone could protect his family from what had happened. 5-year-old Theo clutched his mother's hand so tightly that his tiny fingers had turned pale. The three remained there long after the mourners departed. Lord Nathaniel Everly had been buried only hours earlier. The silence he left behind felt larger than the manor itself. Seraphina stared at the simple stone marker bearing her husband's name and struggled to imagine tomorrow. Nathaniel had not been a perfect man, but he had been kind. He had loved their boys. He had laughed easily and dreamed of futures that now lay buried beneath damp earth. At 28 years old, Seraphina suddenly found herself a widow with 2 children and no clear path forward. The first signs of disaster appeared before the flowers on Nathaniel's grave had begun to wilt. Letters arrived, then creditors, then lawyers. One by one, men carrying documents crossed the threshold of Everly Manor and dismantled the life Seraphina had known. Hidden debts emerged from places she did not understand. Investments she had never heard of had somehow failed. Agreements bearing Nathaniel's signature surfaced from locked boxes and dusty archives. Each discovery stole another piece of security. Seraphina spent long evenings studying papers by candlelight while her sons slept nearby. She searched desperately for answers, yet every document seemed to lead toward the same conclusion. The estate was drowning. The relatives arrived shortly afterward. They came dressed in black and spoke with practiced sympathy. Nathaniel's cousins expressed concern for her welfare. They offered assistance. They promised guidance. Yet beneath their polished manners, Seraphina sensed something calculating. Her instincts proved correct. Within weeks they presented legal claims that transferred much of the estate into their control. They spoke of protecting family assets and satisfying creditors. Every argument sounded reasonable when spoken aloud. Yet the result remained the same. Everly Manor no longer belonged to her. The day she and her sons were forced to leave, rain streaked the tall windows of the drawing room. Servants avoided her eyes as trunks were carried outside. Oliver stood beside his mother, jaw clenched with a determination no child should have needed. Theo sat on a staircase clutching a wooden horse his father had carved for him. "Where are we going?" Theo asked quietly. Seraphina knelt before him and smoothed his hair. "Somewhere safe." The answer felt fragile even to her. Their carriage rolled away from the manor shortly before dusk. Neither boy looked back. The following weeks taught Seraphina how quickly society could forget. Doors that had once opened eagerly now remained closed. Women who had praised her grace suddenly found reasons to avoid her. Invitations disappeared. Conversations ended when she approached. Noble families that had once sought her company now treated her circumstances like a contagious illness. A few gentlemen expressed interest in marriage. Those hopes lasted only until they learned about Oliver and Theo. The pattern repeated so often that Seraphina eventually recognized the moment disappointment entered their eyes. A widow was inconvenient. A widow with children was unacceptable. At a gathering hosted by a distant acquaintance, she overheard voices drifting from behind a nearby doorway. "No nobleman wants another man's children. The boys would complicate everything. She should be grateful for any offer at all." The words struck harder because they were spoken casually, as though her sons were burdens rather than blessings. That evening Seraphina returned to her modest rented rooms and found Oliver pretending not to cry. He had heard similar remarks. Without speaking, she gathered both boys into her arms. "If the whole world turns against us," she whispered, "we stay together." Oliver nodded immediately. Theo buried his face against her shoulder. In that moment Seraphina understood there would be no rescue coming from society. No distant relative would intervene. No wealthy admirer would appear. Whatever future awaited them would have to be built through endurance. So she sold jewelry, then dresses, then treasured heirlooms she had once hoped to pass to her children. Every sacrifice purchased a little more time. Yet winter crept closer. By late autumn their funds had nearly vanished. Then unexpectedly a rumor reached her ears. Thornfield Castle required assistance organizing generations of neglected records and correspondence. The position was temporary, modestly paid, and far beneath what society believed suitable for a noblewoman. Seraphina accepted immediately. A week later, beneath a sky dark with approaching storms, she traveled toward the vast estate with Oliver and Theo beside her. Rain battered the carriage roof throughout the journey. By the time they reached the castle gates, wind howled across the countryside like a living thing. The castle itself rose from the landscape like something carved from legend. Massive stone towers pierced the storm clouds. Warm lights glowed behind distant windows. For a brief moment, Seraphina wondered whether she belonged anywhere near such a place. Then Theo shivered. She straightened her shoulders and approached the entrance. Inside, servants exchanged uncertain glances at the sight of a noble widow arriving with 2 children in tow. Wet from rain and exhausted from travel, Seraphina nevertheless carried herself with quiet dignity. Moments later, another figure entered the hall. Tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably composed. Duke Alaric Thornfield. The most powerful nobleman in the region stopped several paces away and regarded the woman standing before him. His expression revealed little, yet his eyes lingered on Oliver protecting his younger brother, on Theo fighting exhaustion, and finally on Seraphina herself. Many people had looked at her recently. Most had seen inconvenience. Some had seen weakness. Others had seen a problem to avoid. For the first time in many months, someone seemed to see something else. That night, after hearing her circumstances, Alaric ordered rooms prepared for all 3 of them. Long after the boys fell asleep beneath warm blankets, Seraphina stood beside their beds and watched them rest peacefully for the first time in weeks. Tears gathered silently in her eyes. Unseen from the doorway, the Duke paused in the corridor and witnessed the moment. Then, without announcing his presence, he remained there a heartbeat longer than necessary, as though something about the forgotten widow and her sons had disturbed a carefully guarded corner of his heart. Morning arrived gently at Thornfield Castle. Sunlight spilled through tall windows, turning the ancient stone corridors gold and filling the vast estate with a warmth that seemed almost unfamiliar. For Seraphina Everly, the sight felt unreal. She had spent so many weeks worrying about shelter, food, and survival that waking beneath a solid roof still felt like a fragile dream. She rose before dawn, careful not to wake Oliver and Theo. The boys slept deeply beneath thick blankets, their faces relaxed in a way she had not seen since before their father's death. Watching them, Seraphina felt a cautious hope she hardly dared acknowledge. Whatever happened next, they were safe for now. That single truth gave her strength. After dressing, she reported to the castle library. The room was unlike anything she had imagined. Shelves stretched toward a painted ceiling. Thousands of volumes lined the walls. Cabinets overflowed with ledgers, letters, contracts, and records accumulated over generations. Dust floated through shafts of sunlight while the scent of leather and parchment lingered in the still air. It was chaos disguised as order. Seraphina immediately understood why help had been required. 4 hours she worked carefully, sorting documents and creating inventories. Her hands moved steadily across pages while her mind focused on the task. Organizing records felt strangely comforting. Every ledger she restored to its proper place created a sense of control that her own life had lacked for months. Near midday she became aware of someone watching. Looking up, she found Duke Alaric Thornfield standing quietly near one of the shelves. He wore a dark riding coat and carried himself with the same disciplined composure she remembered from their first meeting. Yet there was curiosity in his gaze. "You have already accomplished more in 1 morning than 3 clerks managed in 6 months, he observed. Seraphina lowered her eyes respectfully. "The records deserve proper care, Your Grace." A faint smile touched his mouth before disappearing almost immediately. It transformed his face more than she expected. For a brief moment he looked younger, less burdened. Then he nodded and departed. The encounter lasted less than a minute. Yet she found herself thinking about it long afterward. Outside the library, Oliver and Theo were beginning their own transformation. The castle grounds became a world of endless discovery. There were gardens, stables, fountains, and winding paths hidden between ancient trees. The boys explored every corner they were permitted to visit. For children who had recently lost almost everything, the freedom felt miraculous. Oliver especially became fascinated by the horses. Whenever his responsibilities allowed, he lingered near the stables watching the animals with quiet admiration. He rarely asked questions. Pride often prevented him from revealing how much he wanted something. Alaric noticed. One afternoon he found Oliver standing beside a magnificent black stallion. "Do you ride?" the Duke asked. Oliver shook his head. "My father planned to teach me." The words carried a sadness beyond his years. Without another word, Alaric instructed a stable master to prepare a gentle horse. The lesson began immediately. At first Oliver sat rigidly in the saddle, afraid of making mistakes. Yet Alaric proved patient. His instructions were calm, precise, and encouraging. Each small success strengthened the boy's confidence. By the end of the afternoon, Oliver was smiling. Not the polite smile he offered adults. A genuine one. Alaric found himself unexpectedly pleased by the sight. The lessons continued throughout the following weeks. Trust slowly developed between them. Oliver began seeking the Duke's approval without realizing it. Alaric began looking forward to their afternoons together. Meanwhile, Theo conquered the castle in an entirely different way. Where Oliver was cautious, Theo was affectionate. Servants quickly adored him. He greeted everyone warmly, remembered names, and thanked people for the smallest kindnesses. His innocence softened even the sternest faces. One morning during breakfast, Theo committed a mistake that silenced the entire room. Alaric happened to be sharing the table with the family while discussing library matters with Seraphina. Theo reached for a piece of bread. "Your Grace, Father, may I have?" The child froze. The room became perfectly still. Theo's eyes widened in horror. He immediately lowered his head. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Seraphina felt her heart stop. She expected embarrassment, perhaps even anger. Instead, something remarkable happened. Alaric looked at the frightened boy and quietly passed him the bread. Of course. Nothing more. No criticism. No correction. Just kindness. Theo's relief was immediate. The servants exchanged startled glances. Seraphina found herself unable to speak. Later that evening she thanked the Duke. "You were very generous." Alaric stared toward the distant gardens. "He is a child." The answer sounded simple. Yet beneath it she sensed something deeper. A loneliness perhaps. Or an understanding of loss. Days turned into weeks. The castle gradually changed. Laughter appeared where silence had once ruled. Theo's cheerful voice echoed through hallways. Oliver's writing lessons became a familiar sight. Even the servants seemed happier. The greatest change, however, occurred within Alaric himself. For years he had lived according to duty alone. His days followed rigid patterns. His castle functioned efficiently but without warmth. Now he found himself lingering at dinner conversations. He listened when Theo described imaginary adventures. He discussed books with Seraphina in the library. He watched Oliver's progress with genuine pride. The emptiness he had carried for so long began to retreat. One evening he stood beside an upper balcony overlooking the gardens. Below, Seraphina sat beneath a tree reading while the boys played nearby. Golden sunset light spilled across the grass. Theo chased butterflies. Oliver attempted to teach his younger brother the writing techniques he had learned. Seraphina laughed softly when both boys failed spectacularly. The sound drifted upward on the breeze. Alaric remained motionless. Something unfamiliar settled within his chest. Not longing. Not exactly. Something quieter. Something more dangerous. The realization that Thornfield no longer felt complete without them. As if sensing his gaze, Seraphina looked upward. For a brief moment their eyes met across the distance. Neither looked away immediately. Then the moment passed. Yet neither forgot it. Inside the castle, servants had begun noticing what was happening. Conversations quieted whenever the Duke entered a room. Rumors spread through kitchens, hallways, and eventually beyond the castle walls. Noble visitors observed how naturally the boys gravitated toward him. They noticed how often Seraphina occupied his thoughts. Before long, whispers traveled into society itself. Some spoke with curiosity. Others spoke with disapproval. Few believed such closeness could continue without consequence. One evening a sealed letter arrived from a noble household known for its influence and ambition. Alaric read its contents in silence, his expression hardening with every line. When he finally lowered the paper, his gaze drifted toward the library where Seraphina worked, and for the first time since they arrived, he realized the peace growing within Thornfield was about to attract enemies. The first snowfall of the season arrived quietly over Thornfield Castle. White flakes drifted beyond the library windows, settling upon ancient rooftops and dark evergreen trees. Inside, warmth glowed from iron sconces while rows of books stood in solemn silence. Seraphina sat alone at a massive oak table surrounded by ledgers, correspondence, and estate records that stretched back generations. What had begun as simple cataloging had evolved into something else entirely. A question. A doubt she could not ignore. The discovery had started with a familiar name. Nathaniel Everly. She had encountered it while organizing archived trade records connected to neighboring estates. At first she nearly overlooked it. Yet something about the date caught her attention. According to official accounts, her husband had suffered severe financial losses during that year. The documents before her suggested otherwise. Seraphina examined the pages again. Then again. The figures refused to change. Several transactions attributed to Nathaniel directly contradicted the debts that had supposedly ruined him. Her pulse quickened. For months she had accepted the narrative presented after his death. Everyone had spoken as though financial disaster had been inevitable. The evidence had appeared overwhelming. Now uncertainty crept into that certainty. She spent the following days searching through additional records. The deeper she dug, the stranger the inconsistencies became. Contracts carried signatures that appeared slightly unnatural. Account books contained alterations hidden beneath careful corrections. Payments had vanished. Land transfers had occurred under suspicious circumstances. Individually, the discrepancies seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern. One evening she remained in the library long after sunset. Candles flickered across the table while wind rattled distant windows. Sheet after sheet lay spread before her. She finally reached a conclusion she could no longer deny. Nathaniel had been framed. The realization left her trembling. Not because it restored her husband's reputation. Because it revealed something far more dangerous. Someone powerful had benefited from his destruction. A floorboard creaked behind her. Seraphina turned sharply. Alaric stood in the shadows near the doorway. His gaze moved from her face to the scattered documents. "You have found something." It was not a question. She hesitated only briefly before explaining everything. The Duke listened without interruption. When she finished, silence settled between them. Most people would have dismissed her suspicions. Most people would have advised caution. Alaric merely studied the evidence. Finally he nodded. "I believe you." The words carried unexpected weight. For a moment Seraphina could only stare at him. Trust had become rare in her life. Receiving it felt almost overwhelming. "Then what do I do?" she asked quietly. Alaric stepped closer. "We uncover the truth." From that night forward, the investigation became theirs. The Duke used trusted agents to gather information discreetly. Seraphina continued searching records hidden throughout the castle archives. Every discovery revealed deeper corruption. Names emerged repeatedly. Influential merchants, powerful landowners, members of noble society, people whose wealth had increased immediately after Nathaniel's downfall. The scope of the conspiracy grew larger with every answer. Yet danger also grew. Word eventually escaped the castle. Someone noticed questions being asked. Someone realized old secrets were being disturbed. The first consequences appeared through gossip. At social gatherings, conversations stopped when Seraphina entered. Ladies who had previously ignored her now watched her carefully. Whispers followed her through drawing rooms and corridors. At first the rumors seemed harmless. Then Lady Vivian Ashcombe became involved. Vivian possessed everything society admired. Beauty, status, influence. 4 years she had been considered the most likely candidate to become Duchess Thornfield. Her family openly encouraged the possibility. Many nobles assumed an announcement was only a matter of time. Unfortunately for Vivian, reality had begun moving in a different direction. She noticed the Duke's growing attachment to Seraphina. She noticed how often he sought her company. She noticed how naturally the boys gravitated toward him. Most of all, she noticed that Alaric had never looked at her the way he sometimes looked at the widow. Jealousy hardened into determination. Determination became hostility. The rumors transformed almost overnight. People began claiming Seraphina had deliberately pursued the Duke. Others suggested she used her sons to gain sympathy. Some insisted her investigation was merely an attempt to recover lost wealth. Every lie spread faster than truth ever could. One afternoon Seraphina entered a tea gathering and found conversations dying around her like extinguished candles. She understood immediately. They were discussing her. Again. The humiliation reminded her of the darkest weeks following Nathaniel's death. The same judgment. The same rejection. The same cruel certainty that she did not belong. Yet this time the pain felt sharper. Because now she had something worth losing. That evening she returned to Thornfield emotionally exhausted. Theo sensed her sadness first. The child climbed into her lap without speaking. Oliver stood nearby, protective as always. "Did someone upset you?" he asked. Seraphina forced a smile. "A little." Oliver's expression darkened. "I do not care what they say." The fierce loyalty in his voice nearly broke her heart. Neither boy deserved the cruelty directed toward their family. Neither boy understood why adults could be so unkind. Later, after putting them to bed, she wandered through the silent castle corridors. The stone walls seemed colder than usual. The whispers followed her even here. Not physically, emotionally. An invisible burden she could not escape. As she turned a corner, she found Alaric standing alone beside a window. Moonlight silvered his features. For a moment she considered speaking. Instead she remained silent. So did he. The distance between them suddenly felt enormous. Days passed. The investigation advanced steadily. Evidence accumulated. Several names connected directly to the forged records. Alaric spent increasing amounts of time meeting privately with advisors and investigators. Unfortunately, his growing secrecy created an unintended consequence. He stopped explaining things. Not because he doubted Seraphina. Because he was protecting the inquiry. Yet from her perspective, everything appeared different. The Duke became harder to reach. Conversations shortened. His attention shifted elsewhere. The certainty she once felt began eroding. Had the rumors affected him? Had society finally succeeded? Had he started questioning her motives? The possibility haunted her. One rainy afternoon she entered the library and found two servants speaking quietly near the entrance. They fell silent when they noticed her. Their guilty expressions told her enough. More rumors. More suspicion. More judgment. Seraphina continued working, but the words blurred before her eyes. By evening she could no longer concentrate. She stood beside a window watching rain slide down the glass. Beyond the gardens, darkness swallowed the landscape. For months Thornfield had felt like sanctuary. Now uncertainty crept through its foundations. She remembered every cruel remark society had ever directed toward her. Every rejection. Every closed door. Every reminder that widows with children occupied an unwelcome place in noble life. Perhaps she had been foolish to believe things could truly change. Perhaps happiness had only been temporary. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. A messenger entered carrying sealed correspondence recently delivered for the Duke. As he crossed the room, one letter slipped from the stack and landed near her feet. Without meaning to, Seraphina noticed the broken wax seal. Inside, several visible lines caught her eye. She read only a fragment before the messenger retrieved it. Yet the damage was done. The letter contained Lady Vivian's name. And one devastating sentence. The engagement announcement must not be delayed any longer. Long after the messenger departed, Seraphina remained frozen beside the window, staring into the rain, while for the first time since arriving at Thornfield Castle, she wondered whether the future she had secretly begun hoping for had never belonged to her at all. Winter settled over the kingdom with glittering elegance and hidden cruelty. Snow lined the roads leading to the royal capital, while countless carriages carried nobles toward the grand palace where the season's most anticipated celebration awaited. The king's winter ball was more than a social gathering. It was a stage upon which alliances were formed, reputations elevated, and futures decided. For Seraphina Everly, it felt like walking toward judgment. The invitation had arrived a week earlier. Officially, she had been included as a guest of Thornfield Castle. Unofficially, she knew many would question her presence. The rumors surrounding her had spread far beyond the Duke's estate. Whispers followed her name through drawing rooms, salons, and country manors. Some claimed she had manipulated Duke Alaric Thornfield. Others insisted she was chasing a title she did not deserve. The lies had become so widespread that even silence seemed to accuse her. On the evening of the ball, she stood before a mirror while a maid fastened the final buttons of her gown. The dress was beautiful. Deep sapphire silk flowed gracefully to the floor, its modest elegance emphasizing rather than disguising her natural beauty. Her dark hair had been arranged carefully, and a small necklace, one of the few possessions she had managed to keep, rested against her throat. Yet none of it eased the unease within her. A knock sounded at the door. Oliver entered first. Theo followed immediately behind him. Both boys wore formal attire prepared for younger guests attending the royal festivities. "You look like a queen," Theo announced proudly. Seraphina smiled despite her anxiety. Oliver studied her carefully. "You do not have to go if you don't want to." The maturity in his voice startled her. Children noticed far more than adults realized. She knelt and embraced both sons. "I'll be back before you know it." Theo wrapped his arms around her neck. "Will His Grace be there?" The question tightened something inside her chest. "Yes." Theo smiled. Oliver remained thoughtful. Neither boy understood the growing tension surrounding the Duke. Neither knew about the letter mentioning Lady Vivian. Perhaps that innocence was a blessing. By nightfall, the palace blazed with light. Thousands of candles illuminated soaring ceilings covered with gold leaf and painted cherubs. Crystal chandeliers scattered brilliance across polished marble floors. Music drifted through vast halls while noblemen and ladies moved like living jewels beneath the glittering glow. When Seraphina entered beside Alaric, conversations briefly paused. She felt it immediately. The scrutiny, the curiosity, the judgment. Alaric offered no sign that he noticed. His expression remained composed and unreadable. Yet his presence beside her provided a measure of comfort. For a short while. Then noble society began its work. Small comments emerged first. Whispers disguised as conversation. Polite smiles concealing sharper intentions. A group of ladies fell silent as she approached. Another turned away mid-sentence. A gentleman she vaguely recognized looked at her son's empty places at the family tables and smirked knowingly. Every encounter chipped away at her confidence. Across the ballroom, Lady Vivian Ashcombe watched everything. She wore crimson silk and enough diamonds to rival the chandeliers above. Beautiful and poised, she embodied everything society expected from a future duchess. More importantly, she behaved as though the position already belonged to her. Throughout the evening, influential nobles gravitated toward her. Many seemed convinced that Duke Alaric would soon announce their engagement. The expectation lingered everywhere. Seraphina felt it with every passing hour. Then came the dance. An orchestra filled the ballroom with music as couples assembled across the floor. Several women eagerly anticipated Alaric's choice of partner. When he approached Seraphina instead, a visible ripple moved through the crowd. For a moment she almost forgot the whispers. His hand was steady. His gaze remained fixed on hers. Together they moved across the polished floor. The world seemed to narrow. Music, light, the warmth of his hand. Nothing else. Then the dance ended. Reality returned. Alaric was immediately summoned away by one of his advisors. Something serious passed between them. Without explanation he excused himself. "I will return shortly." Seraphina nodded. Yet unease followed him as he disappeared into the crowd. Minutes became nearly an hour. The Duke did not return. Unfortunately, Lady Vivian did. The noblewoman approached surrounded by admirers. Her smile appeared flawless. Her eyes did not. "I do hope you are enjoying the evening," Vivian said pleasantly. Seraphina recognized danger immediately. "I am." "How wonderful." The response sounded kind. The meaning beneath it was not. Several nearby guests subtly shifted closer. Everyone sensed entertainment approaching. Vivian tilted her head. "You have certainly inspired discussion throughout the kingdom." Seraphina refused to retreat. "I cannot control what people choose to discuss." "No," Vivian replied softly. "Though some situations invite attention." A few nobles chuckled. The sound echoed through Seraphina's chest. Vivian continued. "You must admit your circumstances are unusual." Before Seraphina could answer, another voice joined the conversation. An older nobleman holding a glass of wine smiled cruelly. "Unusual is one word for it." Several guests turned toward him. The man laughed lightly. Then he delivered the remark that shattered whatever dignity the evening had left her. "She comes with two burdens no duke would willingly inherit." Silence followed. Not shocked silence. Complicit silence. The kind that revealed agreement. Nobody defended her. Nobody challenged the cruelty. They simply watched. Watched a widow being reminded of her place. Watched a mother reduced to an inconvenience. Watched her children described as burdens. Seraphina felt every eye in the room upon her. Humiliation burned through her. Not for herself. For Oliver and Theo. The boys who had lost their father. The boys who had endured hardship without complaint. The boys who deserved love rather than contempt. And Alaric was nowhere to be found. The realization hurt most of all. Moments earlier she had almost believed something meaningful existed between them. Now she stood alone. Again. Just as she had after Nathaniel's death. Just as she had when society turned its back on her. The ball continued around her, but she no longer heard the music. She quietly left the ballroom. No one tried to stop her. Snow fell gently as her carriage carried her back to Thornfield Castle. By the time she arrived, her decision had already been made. She would leave. Not tomorrow. Not eventually. Tonight. The castle corridors were silent as she packed their belongings. Every folded garment felt like surrender. Every closed trunk felt like the end of a dream she had never dared fully claim. Oliver woke first. The sight of packed luggage told him everything. "We're leaving." It was not a question. Seraphina nodded. Pain flashed across his face. Theo woke moments later and immediately began crying. "I don't want to go." Neither did she. Yet staying felt impossible. How could she remain where she did not belong? How could she stay and watch Alaric choose another woman? How could she ask her sons to endure more humiliation? Before dawn, a carriage waited beyond the castle gates. Snow covered the ground in a blanket of white. The boys climbed inside reluctantly. Theo looked back repeatedly toward the distant towers. Oliver remained silent. As the carriage rolled away, Seraphina stared at Thornfield Castle disappearing into the pale morning darkness. Somewhere inside those stone walls remained the life she had briefly imagined for herself, a future built on kindness, belonging, and hope. She forced herself not to look back again. Yet miles away, in a private chamber of the royal palace, Duke Alaric Thornfield was reading the final piece of evidence that would destroy her enemies forever, completely unaware that the woman he had spent months protecting had already vanished from his life. Dawn broke beneath a sky of pale silver as Duke Alaric Thornfield rode through the frozen countryside with relentless determination. Frost coated the roads. Wind lashed against his face. Neither discomfort nor exhaustion mattered. Only one thought occupied his mind. Seraphina was gone. The discovery had struck him harder than any battlefield wound. He had returned from the royal palace shortly before sunrise carrying enough evidence to destroy every person responsible for Nathaniel Everly's downfall. Months of investigation had finally produced the truth. Forged records had been exposed. Corrupt noblemen had been identified. Hidden accounts had been uncovered. The conspiracy was finished. He had ridden home eager to tell her. Instead he had found empty rooms. An untouched breakfast tray. A maid struggling not to cry. And a note. The letter had been painfully brief. She thanked him for his generosity. She apologized for any inconvenience her presence had caused. She wished him happiness. Nothing more. Nothing less. Yet every word felt like a farewell. For several minutes Alaric had stood motionless in her abandoned chamber, staring at the note while a terrible realization settled over him. She believed he had chosen someone else. She believed every lie. Worse, she had left carrying that pain. The thought ignited a fury unlike anything he had experienced in years. Not toward Seraphina. Toward himself. His silence had been necessary for the investigation. His secrecy had protected the evidence. Yet none of that mattered now. Because the woman he loved had walked away believing she was unwanted. The moment he understood that truth, he ordered his horse prepared. Now he rode across the kingdom searching for her. Every village brought new questions. Every crossroads produced another lead. Stablemasters recognized the description of a widow traveling with 2 boys. Innkeepers pointed him toward distant roads. Travelers recalled seeing a tired woman with determined eyes and 2 children at her side. Each clue carried him closer. Meanwhile, Seraphina sat beside a small inn window near the northern border of the kingdom. Snow drifted lazily beyond the glass. Oliver sat quietly reading near the fire. Theo slept with his head resting against her shoulder. The journey had exhausted them. So had the heartbreak. For 3 days she had tried convincing herself she made the correct choice. Each attempt failed. The castle haunted her thoughts. Theo's laughter in the gardens. Oliver's writing lessons. Evenings spent among books. Conversations with Alaric. Memories followed her everywhere. Still, she refused to regret leaving. The ball had revealed the truth. Society would never accept her. Perhaps more painfully, she believed Alaric had never intended to fight for her. A commotion outside interrupted her thoughts. Voices rose. Doors opened. Footsteps crossed the inn courtyard. Moments later the common room fell silent. Seraphina looked up. Her breath caught. Alaric stood in the doorway. Snow dusted his dark coat. His hair was disheveled by travel. Exhaustion shadowed his features. Yet his eyes never left her. For a heartbeat neither moved. Then Theo noticed him. "Your Grace." The child launched himself forward. Alaric caught him effortlessly. Something vulnerable flickered across the Duke's face as Theo wrapped both arms around his neck. Oliver stood next. Unlike his brother, he hesitated. Pain lingered behind his composure. "You left," Oliver said quietly. The words struck harder than any accusation. Alaric lowered himself until he stood at eye level with the boy. "I was too late." Oliver studied him carefully. Then he nodded once. The forgiveness of children often arrived more quickly than adults deserved. The surrounding travelers watched with growing fascination. Nobody spoke. Everyone sensed something important unfolding. Finally Alaric turned toward Seraphina. The distance between them felt enormous despite being only a few steps. "Why did you leave?" Emotion tightened her throat. "You already know why." "No." His voice remained calm. "I know what you believed. She looked away. The humiliation of the ball still burned within her. The kingdom believes I am an opportunist. I do not care what the kingdom believes. Lady Vivian clearly expected an engagement. Lady Vivian expected many things. Pain flashed across Seraphina's face. And you said nothing. The accusation lingered between them. Alaric accepted it, because it was true. For a long moment neither spoke. Then he reached inside his coat and withdrew a collection of documents. The inn grew quieter. One by one he placed them upon a nearby table. These are the records proving Nathaniel Everly's innocence. Seraphina froze. The forged accounts have been exposed. Another document followed. The conspirators have confessed. Then another. The estates taken from your family have been restored. Her pulse thundered. She stared at the papers in disbelief. Alaric continued. The men responsible have been arrested. A stunned murmur swept through the room. Travelers exchanged astonished glances. The Duke was not finished. He produced a final decree bearing the royal seal. The crown has formally cleared your husband's name. Tears filled Seraphina's eyes. Everything she had fought for. Everything she had sacrificed. Everything she had hoped to prove. It was done. Nathaniel's honor had been restored. The burden she carried for so long suddenly cracked apart. Yet Alaric's gaze remained fixed upon her. There was still more to say. Far more. At that exact moment another carriage arrived outside the inn. Several mounted guards escorted it. The door opened. Lady Vivian Ashcombe stepped into the common room. Shock spread across her face when she saw the gathering. Then fear followed. The guards moved immediately. One presented official warrants. The room erupted into whispers. Evidence linking Vivian to the campaign of lies had surfaced only hours earlier. Letters, payments, witnesses. Her efforts to manipulate society and interfere with the investigation had finally been uncovered. For the first time her confidence shattered. She looked toward Alaric. He never looked back. The guards escorted her away while silence filled the room. The chapter she represented ended without dignity. Exactly as her schemes deserved. When the doors finally closed behind her, all attention returned to Seraphina and the Duke. Alaric stepped forward. His expression softened. Every mask he normally wore disappeared. The powerful Duke, the disciplined ruler, the feared nobleman, all vanished. Only the man remained. Then before the entire inn he dropped to one knee. Gasps filled the room. Seraphina's eyes widened. Alaric reached for Oliver's hand first. Then Theo's. The boys stared at him. He held their hands carefully, protectively, like something precious. When he finally spoke, emotion roughened his voice. I do not want a duchess without her sons. Tears spilled freely down Seraphina's cheeks. Alaric looked at Oliver. Then Theo. Then their mother. I want all three of you. For a moment nobody moved. The world itself seemed to pause. Then Theo burst into tears and threw himself against the Duke. Oliver followed a second later. Years of loneliness, grief, and uncertainty dissolved inside that embrace. Seraphina covered her mouth as sobs escaped her. Alaric rose slowly and stepped toward her. I should have told you sooner. You should have. I love you. The simple honesty shattered every remaining barrier. She laughed through tears. Then nodded. Then my answer is yes. Applause erupted throughout the inn. Travelers cheered. Strangers smiled. Even hardened merchants wiped suspicious moisture from their eyes. Months later, golden sunlight illuminated Thornfield Castle as a magnificent carriage approached the gates. Rain fell softly from a spring sky, glimmering like liquid silver upon the stone walls. Servants lined the entrance. Villagers gathered nearby. The kingdom's newest duchess stepped gracefully from the carriage while holding Oliver's hand and Theo's hand. Duke Alaric Thornfield descended beside them and offered her his arm. Together they crossed the courtyard as a family. Around them stood the same society that had once whispered, no nobleman would want the mother of two children. Yet those voices were gone now. In their place rose admiration, respect, and wonder. For the kingdom had witnessed something greater than romance. It had witnessed a powerful man choosing not merely the woman he loved, but the children she loved most. And as the castle doors opened before them and their future stretched bright and limitless beyond the threshold, neither Seraphina nor her sons ever doubted again that they were finally home.